Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the value you bring as a brand outside of the product that you sell. Most successful brands bring value to their customers outside of just what the actual purchase is. The funniest, silliest ads I have made have driven the most exponential growth in ad accounts I have worked on. Doing this work of figuring out what is the value outside of the product, it shouldn't impede your actual performance. It should, in fact, accelerate it. I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today, I wanted to talk about something that I think is really interesting, but also, if I didn't think it was interesting, we wouldn't be talking about it. So I guess that's not really a great pre-qualifier. It doesn't really add any value that I think it's interesting. But anyway, we've been talking a lot about the idea of an omnipresent brand, and we've been talking a lot about resonance on the podcast lately and building true long-lasting relationships with your audience. And today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the value you bring as a brand outside of the product that you sell. This is a topic that is really interesting to me from a more sort of cultural point of view rather than like just straight up e-commerce, which is why it kind of lives in this like middle space where it's not really something that you tend to think about or plan for when you're thinking about growth as a DTC brand. But it's really important to acknowledge that most successful brands do bring value to their customers outside of just what the actual purchase is. And we're going to get a little bit more into what I mean by that a little bit further in the episode, but that's just sort of setting the stage. What we're going to talk about today is what you actually add to people's lives as a brand. To sort of recap, I've been talking about this phrase, omnipresent brand, for a few weeks, maybe even a couple months now. I don't know, time flies. Essentially, the hypothesis there is that we are living in a post-millennial brand era, of course. Nobody is loving those sort of earnest takes on a business. And we've moved towards what I've been calling the omnipresent brand era, which essentially refers to this period of time we're in where people are really stuck to the brands that they purchase and interact with in a deeper way than ever before. Brands are much more intertwined with someone's sense of self and identity than they have been in the past 50 to 70 years. So there's something really interesting going on there. As a brand, if you're not acknowledging what that value you bring beyond the product is, then you're sort of missing out on ways to really capitalize on this omnipresent brand era and really figure out where you fit into someone's world and identity. I'm going to go through two very different examples because I think it's worth sort of talking about. And both of these are really interesting from a sort of brand case study perspective, but I kind of want to forget about any like standout ads that we've seen. I want to forget about any like celebrity endorsement factors, and I just want to talk about what people get from owning a product under this brand, because I do think that is the central sort of talking point of this episode today. So let's get into it. Let's talk through a couple of examples. The first one I want to talk about is sort of like a brand darling in the digital age, which, by the way, makes me sound ancient to say digital age. But I want to talk about Liquid Death because I think Liquid Death is a really interesting example when we're talking about what kind of value is being added to someone's life by purchasing through a specific brand. Because Liquid Death, as we all know, or maybe you don't know, so I'll run you up to speed. They sell, you've probably seen them, you've seen their sort of social presence online, or you've seen them maybe in stores. They sell mostly water in cans that look cool. That's kind of it. And the idea is, if you are a sober queen, you don't want to drink alcohol, it's a different way to consume like a non-alcoholic sparkling water. If you are in an environment where people are drinking, it's like there's a real juxtaposition in what they sell and how they brand themselves. And they're sort of feeding this market of most likely men who don't drink for any reason, but don't want to show up with like a LaCroix to the Super Bowl party. You know what I mean? Which I'm not going to get into it, but that's weird. Just drink a nice little bubbly and be fine with it. But Liquid Death is servicing a group of people who have concerns that I can't really understand about drinking bubbly around their male friends. I don't know. Anyway, back to the actual example at hand. So like I mentioned, Liquid Death, they're selling a product that like you wouldn't associate with the aesthetic that they have. And so what is the value that Liquid Death is bringing to their customers? Is it a refreshing water? Of course. Right. Yes. Is it cool flavors? Yes, of course. But water is a really interesting, I think, like product to use in this, like through this lens, because the value of the product is not like my make-believe mug company where you are providing someone with like cutting edge technology maybe. It's water in a can, which, you know, sometimes if you're lucky enough, you can get water for free out of the tap. It's like there's not a lot of inherent value in the product, which is why I think it's a really fascinating example to think about the value of the brand to the consumer. Because like I mentioned, the way that they have positioned themselves in the market is that they are sort of a fringe alternative to drinking rather than a different way to consume water. So if you want to just like walk with me for a second, we're not talking about the actual product at all, even with like very top of funnel general Liquid Death marketing. We're never talking about the product because the product isn't really valuable without the brand. And that is almost like I think most of the time, if you describe that to someone and you weren't talking about Liquid Death, it feels like a precarious situation, but they've done such a phenomenal job identifying who needed to be served in the segment of people who don't consume alcohol for the most part, and then really diving in and on a silver platter in a lot of ways, handing them that value over what the actual product value is. So they're, like I mentioned, really a cut and dry example if you think about it, because again, like water on its own is not a super valuable product. You don't see a lot of other players in the space. So bubbly, LaCroix, like they're often also not playing into, again, the value of water or flavored water with a bit of carbonation. What they're playing into in a different way is the value that they bring. LaCroix was like, for some reason, sort of elevated for a while. I don't really know what's going on there. And bubbly is more of like a fun, accessible brand. So everyone in the category is doing the same thing, which is not focusing on the value of the product, rather focusing on the value of the brand. But Liquid Death has just done so in a incredibly intelligent way, which was to look at who's underserved there and then create the brand fully based on what value the brand could bring to someone's identity. So that's Liquid Death as an example. The second example I wanted to talk about was Rhode, which is, of course, Hailey Bieber's beauty company. I'm saying of course because I am a believer still to this day. So I'm kind of tracking what's going on with her because I'm tracking what's going on with Justin, if that makes sense. But Rhode is a really interesting case study. If we remove Hailey Bieber, I just want to say Bieber on the podcast. I just want to talk about Justin Bieber. No, if we remove Hailey Bieber from the equation and we think about Rhode as a standalone, it kind of operates like every other beauty brand out there. I hate to say it to Mrs. Bieber. Not that she's listening. I hate to speak ill of the Bieber name. But Rhode is just sort of the it brand of the moment, which is why I chose it as an example. So like I said, I want to divorce the idea of celebrity ownership a little bit from this conversation. And I just want to talk about this phenomena that we've seen sort of over and over again, where we keep having these like hero beauty brands pop up that oftentimes, let's be so for real, are doing the same thing and selling the same products. There's like really interesting data in how product trends work in the beauty industry, which is endlessly interesting to me. We're all kind of just putting out the same products in the same categories until it switches and there's a new sort of fad going on. Very interesting to operate one of these companies. But anyway, let's talk about Rhode because it is just the sort of in-girl, I'll put quotes on that if you're listening and you can see, quote unquote, in-girl beauty company of the moment. And I want to talk about what the differences are between Liquid Death and Rhode, because I do think the value that they bring comes up in different circumstances. But first, let's just talk about Rhode. They sell like basically what every makeup brand is selling right now. They've got like a lip treatment, so like a lip gloss, as well as some blush. It's real classic stuff, not really out of the box in any way, shape, or form. But what they have is the momentum of brand. And what they also have, which I think is really interesting from someone who lives kind of across different countries during the year, they have had scarcity on their side. So they launched initially in the US, which is a large market, but it is not the only market. And so something really interesting happened there where Rhode sells products that are more likely to be posted online than Liquid Death. So what you get when you launch into the US first, you start to generate demand outside of the US, which is quite a bit of people. We're talking about a very large size of the prize. And then you also start just generating excitement outside of the US, which I think is very interesting. So it's great for logistics if you're, of course, based in the US because it's easier to ship. And if you're only sort of allowing people to purchase through an owned website, which I believe that's the playbook Rhode used, people can only get their products online. They can only get them through you. And you have a phenomenal amount of control at the very beginning. Of course, this was Hailey Bieber doing this. So if you are Joe Schmo looking to launch a product, it'll look a little bit differently and you might not be able to sort of follow this exact playbook. But yeah, starting in the US only, you start to generate buzz in different countries. And then when you launch in those countries, you can continue this sort of fresh, new to market momentum that you wouldn't be able to if you launch worldwide right away. And so I think a lot of beauty brands, again, use this playbook where they launch in their own site in the beginning, and then eventually you move into Sephora, and that is sort of a net new territory to be in because you're in their stores, you're on their website. It's a whole different category. And this is like specific, especially to the smaller brands. Once you get into Sephora, it can really change the game. But I wanted to talk about that sort of piece in that playbook specifically because what Rhode did by following what most brands have done and launching first in the US, having that exclusivity and slowly launching into other countries, is they've created a demand for their brand more so than their product that people have this like innate desire to satiate. So if you think about, like I mentioned before, Rhode is not selling anything that is like net new to the world, okay? It's like a lip liner and a lip gloss. You can get that from any drugstore. But what they are selling is their brand and this idea of exclusivity and being in the know and quote unquote a cool girl, which is so lame to say, you know? Nobody is cool if we're all cringe. Anyway, it creates an atmosphere where, again, like if people really truly wanted to buy a lip liner or a lip gloss, they can do it really anywhere and with any brand. So it's obvious that the product is not what people are looking to purchase there. What they're looking to purchase is the brand Rhode because they would like to be sort of in that bubble and in that space as being a cool girl who knows what the latest makeup brand is and they own it and they can whip their little lip gloss out or put it on their phone, which I think is crazy. And everyone knows that they're sort of part of that unique group. And the same goes for Liquid Death. The really interesting symmetry between these two brands is that both are just, you know, kind of big popular it brands at the moment. And they both are brands that people buy to essentially posture and show off in a way and show that piece of their identity. If you're bringing Liquid Death to the function rather than a can of bubbly you grabbed out of the fridge, you're making a very intentional effort to be seen with that product and to be seen as someone who would purchase that product or be in the know about that product. And the same goes for Rhode. You want people to see you using it. The product itself doesn't matter that much. It is the brand and what it represents to you. And I think both brands have really done a great job executing this piece of figuring out what their value is that they can bring and then focusing on that in tandem with shipping a very good product. And so the value that you bring is going to look quite different depending on the brand that you are. Liquid Death is a good example of this. Same with Rhode, but I wanted to kind of touch on the idea of value outside of social status as well, because typically when we think about these pillars of an omnipresent brand era, we're probably going to consider a lot of the times, if people are wrapping their identity into the brands that they're shopping, that social status is going to be the ultimate value add of brand in this day and age. But something that I want to pay a little bit of attention to is the idea of humor and entertainment being just as valid as a pillar of value for your brands as social status, because social status works again with a large but sort of, I don't want to say it, but boring subset of products and brands. But if you are a brand who's able to invoke that sort of element of true humor and entertainment into your strategy, sky is the limit. The funniest, stupidest, silliest ads I have made have driven the most exponential growth in ad accounts I have worked on. If you can, if it's within your brand and it makes sense, make that value add humor instead of social status, you are going to be printing money, my friend, because people love something that is relatable. They love something that makes them laugh. And it's just a really easy entry point, where social status is a really difficult game to play unless you are married to the cutest boy who's ever lived, Justin Bieber. It's really hard to play the social status game because you're coming into it, trying to posture as already being sort of the cool kid, where if you're playing the humor and entertainment gambit as your value add on top of your product, it's a lot easier to be funny and to be goofy on the internet than it is to be really serious and mysterious and cool, which is just something I have learned along the way. I've definitely worked with brands where, social status was more of the value, and that was fun to come up with ways to maybe tie in real life events or people in that sort of world to tie that social status piece into it, partnering with the right influencers. But it's just a lot more difficult in my experience than heading in the direction of entertainment and humor. So it's all about really figuring out who your target personas are and what your sort of bulk segmentation actually looks like. What are those people interested in? And then going from there. This is something that I've been talking about a lot lately, which is really truly understanding what your target personas want and understanding your intent in making content before going about it. And the same is to be said about figuring out what the value is you can bring on top of those actual products. You want to take a step back and figure out, it's probably going to fall into one of two categories, which is social status or entertainment and humor. You can kind of break things down within that, but those are the main two sort of ideas of value that you can bring to a brand outside of the product. And so really think about, what is the way to go and what are people expecting? I work with a brand and we are in sort of the soft goods space. And the assumption is in that vertical, in that space, you are always going to be playing the social status game. You are looking to give people very elevated aesthetics, and you want it to feel almost just out of reach and aspirational in a way. And what we've done instead is gone the opposite direction, which I think is really interesting. To play with the contradiction is something that always works in ads. Even the example of Liquid Death, which is definitely a social status value add, the way that they go about bringing that social status is often sort of through humor if you look at their ads, which is really interesting to sort of break down. But the ultimate goal is social status, but they do it through humor, which is kind of a confusing loop-de-loop to get there, but it all sort of depends on how you present yourself and how you can bring that value in real life. So the buck doesn't stop for Liquid Death at humor. It doesn't stop at like making a really silly, crazy ad. It stops at someone feeling so moved and so convicted to have a can of Liquid Death that they actually make the purchase. So yeah, that was a very quick episode. I think if you don't really know what the value you bring as a brand is outside of like the actual product, it's important to start mapping that out. No matter where you are really in your journey as a brand, it's important to start thinking about it because you should be weaving it into all of your content. No matter what the outcome is, you should start again thinking about it now so that you can weave it into content. What I find is brands who really understand what this value add is and how they can integrate into someone's identity, they tend to see much higher LTV. They tend to see much higher returning customer rates, and they tend to have like a much easier time. This is so like tactical, but they tend to have a much easier time come Q4 because once you have someone really bought into the value of your brand, guess what? They want to share that value. They want to give that value as a gift. And they are so into your world outside of just believing in your product that it becomes a much easier sell. We talked about this a couple weeks ago about making strategic bundles. And I think this plugs in really nicely where if you have someone who is brought into value beyond just your product, you can start to rely on them to spread the good word about your brand just through word of mouth. And that's when you start to get into really sort of serious growth, when you can depend on customers that you bring in through own channels, through Meta, through Pinterest, Snap, whatever it is, YouTube, those paid eyeballs eventually converting to sort of brand spokespeople is the dream for everyone. And you can't really do that if you don't know what the value you bring is as a brand, because then you can't sort of give them the marching orders, if that makes sense. If they don't know, what the actual value is, they're going to be less likely to talk about your brand favorably. Whereas if you have done the work to figure out what those pieces are, it's just a lot easier, like I mentioned, to foster meaningful, long-lasting relationships with your target personas. If this isn't something you've maybe considered or something that you've tried, but it hasn't quite translated to growth and performance, because that's something I want to highlight too, is that like doing this work of figuring out what is the value outside of the product, it shouldn't impede your actual performance. It should in fact accelerate it. So if you think that your brand that's sort of aiming for social status and you've got this hero product and you're trying to mix these things together and it hasn't really worked for you, you can reach out on our website, palettehouse.co. And if you fill out a lead form, we can chat directly. You can also hit me up on LinkedIn in the DMs and we can schedule some time to chat about sort of what's going on. But if this is work that you've never even thought about, like what does the brand bring outside of the product? Or if it's work that you've thought about, but you haven't been able to execute, or if there's any other questions that you have, feel free to reach out. I think I'm chatting to like 2 folks this week alone who reached out over LinkedIn, which is really cool and really fun. And I'm genuinely so excited. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I hope today was helpful. I tried to keep it kind of quick, as I do when the topic is mostly like, I guess, homework in a way, to go out, think about what value you're bringing, and then kind of start putting pen to paper and figuring out how you can express that. I hope it was helpful. Like I said, reach out if you have any questions, and I will talk to you guys next week.